The wind came before the light. It dragged through the pine trees, carrying the smell of frozen sap and ash from an old fire pit. The year was 1889, the first morning after a week of snowmelt. Jonah Rook stepped out onto the porch, boots creaking against the damp boards, a tin mug trembling in his hand. Steam rose from the coffee, bitter and black, wrapping around his breath like smoke. Somewhere down the valley, a bell rang once, long and hollow, too early for any Sunday. He paused, listening. He hadn't heard that sound in years, and something in it reminded him of a promise he'd buried along with his father's knife. The cabin sat on a slope where the frost still clung to the grass. His horse, Dust, lifted its head from the trough, eyes misty with sleep. Jonah moved slowly, every step measured, as if the mountain might notice his return to life. 10 years of silence had made him wary of noise. He poured the rest of the coffee onto the ground, watching it soak into the frozen dirt, and whispered something no one else could hear. Then he took the knife from the porch rail, ran his thumb along the dull spine, and slid it into its worn sheath. The sun began to pull light through the trees, thin streaks, the color of copper. Jonah saddled Dust, the leather stiff, the cinch creaking. His hands moved from habit, not hurry. The mountain around him was waking, woodpeckers drumming, branches snapping, the slow melt dripping from the eaves. He looked once toward the valley, where red water lay like a scar against the pale plain. It had been a long time since he'd gone down there. Too long, maybe. He started the ride at a slow trot. Frost cracked beneath the hooves. The smell of pine gave way to dust as the path widened, curling between gray boulders shaped by wind. Jonah's coat caught the morning light. Rough wool brushed with dew. Every now and then he'd touch the inside pocket where a folded scrap of paper slept. The last letter from his pamiston, mother, written before she'd died in that same town below. He never read it anymore, but the weight of it had become part of his breathing. Halfway down the ridge, he stopped. The bell sounded again, louder this time, echoing against the cliffs. It wasn't a Sunday bell. It was sharper, urgent. The kind that called people not to pray, but to gather. A memory flickered. Smoke above a church roof. The sound of a woman crying. His own hands bleeding on a shovel handle. He pressed his palm to the saddle horn until his knuckles went white. Not again, he muttered, though he wasn't sure what he meant. Below, the land stretched flat and brittle, dotted with sagebrush. A thin line of riders moved toward town, their figures small against the pale dust. Jonah watched them for a long while. He could smell horses, iron, and the faint sweetness of wind-blown grain. The bell stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence fell hard, the kind that pressed against the skin. He urged Dust forward. The trail wound down between two hills, where an old telegraph pole leaned, wires humming with faint static. On one of the posts, a paper fluttered, its edges torn. He caught it as he passed. An auction notice stamped with the seal of Redwater Bank. Bride Fund, it read. Beneath the inked title was the name, Lila Hart. Jonah read it twice and then folded it slowly, the paper crackling in his glove. He didn't know the woman, but the name stirred something, an echo from a time when he'd still believed the world could be mended. The knife at his belt felt heavier, as if it knew what his mind hadn't yet decided. He looked up toward the sky, gray and tender with dawn, and the thought came quiet as breath. Maybe it was time to see what waited below. The horse snorted, impatient. Jonah slipped the folded notice into his coat pocket, next to the old letter, and turned the reins downhill. His shadow stretched long ahead of him, sliding over rock and frost. As he reached the first fence line of Redwater Valley, the wind shifted, carrying the faint clang of hammers, the murmur of a crowd, and the steady toll of that same church bell. 3 short rings, 1 long. He leaned forward, whispering to dust, "Easy now. We're not done with ghosts yet." The horse obeyed, hooves thudding soft against thawing ground. Somewhere ahead, smoke rose above the steeple, and the morning light caught on the bell's edge, burning red as blood. Dust's hooves struck the frozen road, sending up thin ghosts of dust that hung in the morning air. Redwater appeared by degrees, first the crooked fence posts, then the blacksmith's chimney coughing smoke, then the church spire cutting into a sky still bruised with dawn. The sound of that bell had become sharper, urgent now, carrying down the valley like a command. Jonah pulled his hat lower, tasting the bitterness of iron and wind as he rode through the half-sleeping town. Windows blinked open. Women drew curtains to see who had come down from the mountain. A boy stopped sweeping a porch, staring wide-eyed at the stranger on the dark horse. Jonah could feel their curiosity trail after him like dust in sunlight. 10 years away hadn't made them forget. Redwater remembered everything. He stopped by the trough outside the general store. The water was thin with ice. The storekeeper, Mr. Dawes, stepped out, rubbing his hands on his apron. "Morning," he said, cautious. Jonah nodded once. "Church bell's been at it all morning," Dawes added. "Some sort of charity affair, they say. Banker Pike's idea." Jonah didn't answer. He looked down Main Street where people were gathering near the church steps. Horses tied in rows, wagons stacked with sacks and goods. The bell gave another swing, slower now, its echo trembling through the boards beneath his boots. He dropped a coin for feed, loosened Dust's bridle, and started walking. Inside the churchyard, the air felt too bright. The sun caught the stained glass and scattered blue and red shards across the crowd. Men in town coats, women in faded bonnets. At the center of it all, on a raised platform, stood Edmund Pike, tall silver watch glinting against his vest, voice smooth as syrup. "Gentlemen," he called, "today we do God's work. We rescue a soul from hardship and build a new household under His light." Jonah's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of smile before, the kind that covered rot. Then he saw her, Lila Hart, standing by the rail, hands clasped around a bundle of white flowers already browning at the edges. Her dress was simple, borrowed. He could tell by the way the seams pulled at her shoulders. Sunlight struck her hair, catching threads of copper. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling either. Just waiting, as if the moment might still turn merciful. Pike lifted his hat toward her with mock gentleness. "This young lady has fallen on hard times since her father's passing," he announced. "A good man deserves a good wife, and today Redwater will make that possible." The crowd murmured approval, some from pity, some from habit. Jonah stepped closer, the smell of dust and perfume mixing in the air. Reverend Collins shifted nervously at the altar, his Bible trembling in his hands. Jonah remembered another gathering, another woman, his mother standing beside a casket draped in the flag of a war that hadn't cared for small men. The crowd's silence had felt the same, too polite to be kind. "Let's start the bidding at $50, Pike said. Jonah's boots thudded once against the wooden floor as he entered the church. Heads turned. The murmuring stopped. His coat still carried the mountain's smell, wood smoke, pine, solitude. He moved without hurry, hat in hand, the morning light painting his face in copper streaks. "Sir," Reverend Collins began, uncertain. Jonah's voice was low, gravel rough from disuse. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. The words cut the stillness clean. Lila's head lifted, eyes locking on his. In them, he saw something unexpected. Not fear, but a flicker of recognition, like she'd been waiting for a voice she didn't know she knew. Jonah reached into his saddlebag and laid a small leather pouch on the altar. The sound of coins struck like distant thunder. 10 years of gold dust, he said quietly. Enough to buy peace. He turned to the preacher. "Marry us." Pike's smile faltered. "You can't just—" Jonah met his gaze. "The law says a woman can choose if she's of age." He turned back to Lila. "Do you?" Her hands trembled. The church had gone still, except for the faint hum of the bell rope swaying above. Then she nodded, once, firm, eyes steady on his. Reverend Collins swallowed hard and opened his Bible. His voice shook through the vows, but the words came. Jonah took Lila's hand, her fingers cold as creek water. When he leaned to kiss her, the crowd exhaled, a rustle of disbelief and scandal. Outside, a horse snorted, impatient. A rider pulled his hat down and spurred away toward the bank. Pike's man, carrying word of the insult. Jonah's lips barely brushed Lila's, soft and brief, more vow than claim. "You're safe now," he whispered. But even as he said it, the bell tolled again, low and wrong, like it knew the truth. Safety in Redwater was just another story men liked to tell. The crowd parted as they stepped out into the sunlight. Pike's stare followed, sharp as a blade. Dust stamped its hooves, ready to climb. Jonah helped Lila onto the saddle, the church shadow stretching long behind them. They rode toward the ridge, the wind at their backs carrying the last echo of the bell. 3 short rings, 1 long. Somewhere behind them, the first gunman already swung into his saddle. The road out of Redwater was a ribbon of red dust curling toward the mountains. Behind them, the church bell faded into the wind, replaced by the uneasy quiet of a town holding its breath. Jonah rode ahead, his shoulders rigid beneath the weight of stairs that still clung to him. Lila sat behind him, the hem of her borrowed dress lifting with the horse's stride, her hands uncertain on the saddle horn. No words passed between them for the first mile, only the creak of leather, the rasp of hoof against gravel, and the distant hiss of the wind cutting through dry grass. Jonah's jaw worked like a man chewing on memory. At the ridge turn, he slowed the horse. From there, Redwater was a smudge of smoke and sun, its steeple glinting like a blade in the valley light. Lila turned once to look back, her face unreadable, then straightened. The air was colder up here. She drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You regret it?" Jonah asked, his voice low, carried off by wind almost before she could catch it. "I don't know yet," she said, her tone quiet but steady. "Do you?" He thought about it. "No," he said finally. "Regret comes later, when you've got time to think." They rode on. The trail narrowed through stands of pine, the scent of sap sharp in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. The silence between them shifted, less strained now, more like 2 people listening to the same heartbeat of earth. Lila's thoughts flickered backward, to the church, the faces, the murmurs, the way Reverend Collins's hands trembled as he read the vows. She could still feel the warmth of Jonah's hand, rough and steady, the only solid thing in that sea of judgment. When he'd said, "You're safe now," something in her chest had ached, not with relief but with the unfamiliar weight of being believed. Jonah caught her glance. "You'll want to rest soon," he said. "There's a cabin another hour. Up." "It's yours?" "Was my father's," he answered. "He built it when Redwater was still a camp, and men thought gold could buy peace." His mouth twisted slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. "Turns out peace is harder to dig for." The horse stumbled slightly on loose rock. Lila's hands gripped the saddle, instinctively tightening around Jonah's waist for balance. The contact startled them both. He felt her warmth through the coarse wool of his coat, a simple, human heat he hadn't known in 10 years of winters. He didn't move away. By late afternoon, the trail opened into a clearing. A cabin stood there, rough-hewn but solid, with smoke curling faintly from its chimney, as if it had been waiting for someone to come home. The porch sagged a little, and an old iron kettle hung by the door. The air smelled of wood ash and cold pine. Jonah swung down first, offering her his hand. "Careful," he said. She hesitated before taking it. Her palm was small against his, calloused from work but warm, steady. For a moment, she didn't let go. Inside, the cabin was neat in a way only solitude can make. A rifle leaned against the hearth, and a quilt folded with care rested on a cedar chest. A lantern hung near the window, its glass polished, though clearly unused for years. Lila set her shawl down and looked around. "It's quiet," she said. "Always is," Jonah replied, setting the coffee pot on the stove. "You'll get used to it." She traced her fingers along the edge of the quilt, feeling the faint ridges of hand-stitching. "Someone made this with patience," she murmured. "My mother," he said a man's worth is in what he mends, not what he breaks." The words hung between them, gentle and raw. As night crept over the ridge, the air turned colder. Jonah lit the lantern. Its light painted their faces in gold and shadow. Lila stood near the hearth, her eyes catching the flame. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the smell dark and earthy. She took a sip, grimaced at the bitterness, then smiled faintly. "You drink this every morning?" "10 years of it," he said. "Makes you honest." The smile lingered. For the first time that day, the silence between them wasn't hollow. It was warm, holding room for something fragile. Jonah turned toward the window. Down in the valley, a single spark flared, firelight moving fast, too straight to be a wagon. His hand went to the knife at his belt, thumb resting against the worn handle. "They'll come," he said quietly. Lila followed his gaze. "For me or for you?" He didn't answer. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of hooves, too far to see, but close enough to feel in the floorboards. Jonah reached up and turned down the lantern flame until it was a soft ember in the dark. "Either way," he said, voice calm as the fire's last crackle, "we'll be ready." And in that dim light, Lila could see what the town had never seen. The man beneath the silence, scarred but steady, a storm held behind steady gray eyes. Somewhere below, the bell of Redwater tolled again, thin as a whisper against the night. The trail wound higher, the air thinning until every breath tasted of frost and pine resin. The sky had turned a hard blue, sharp enough to cut through thought. By the time Jonah and Lila reached the ridgeline, the sun had slipped low, burning copper through the branches. Shadows pooled under the trees like water waiting for night. They spoke little. Words felt too loud against the quiet. The mountain listened, and Jonah had learned long ago that it didn't take kindly to chatter. Lila rode behind him, her borrowed dress already dusted with pine needles, her hands red from cold. When the wind shifted, the faint sound of the valley disappeared, leaving only the creak of leather and the slow rhythm of hooves. At the bend, the cabin came into view. A small shape pressed against the side of the mountain, smoke curling thin from its chimney. To Lila, it looked alive, breathing with the rhythm of the wind. She could almost imagine it exhaling warmth. Jonah dismounted first, his boots sinking into the soft mud near the porch. "We'll stay here till the snow finishes melting," he said. "Long enough to think what comes next." "What does come next?" she asked. He glanced at her, then away. "That's the thing about the mountains," he said. "They don't tell you what's ahead until you step into it." Inside, the cabin was warmer than she expected. The scent of ash, cedar, and something faintly sweet hung in the air. A pot of stew from earlier that morning still simmered low in the hearth, its aroma heavy and honest. Jonah moved with quiet efficiency, adding wood, unbuckling his gun belt, setting his knife on the table. Lila stood by the window, staring out at the fading light. From up here, the world below looked unreal, a wash of gold and gray. "You built all this?" she asked. "My father did," Jonah said. "I just kept it from falling apart." Her gaze dropped to the cedar chest near the wall. A folded quilt rested on top, its pattern simple but deliberate. Tiny stitches forming wildflowers across faded fabric. Beside it lay a worn leather notebook, the corners darkened by years of handling. Lila touched them both, fingertips tracing the seams. "She made these, Jonah," said from behind her. "My mother used to say a good home needs 3 things: fire, bread, and something soft enough to forgive the hard days." Lila smiled faintly, her eyes still on the quilt. "Then your home has everything." He didn't answer, just knelt by the hearth, coaxing the fire higher. Sparks rose and vanished into the chimney. For the first time, Lila noticed how his movements carried a quiet grace, like someone accustomed to tending things instead of breaking them. As the evening deepened, she began to unpack the small bundle she'd brought from town. A comb, a handkerchief, a photograph of her father, creased and nearly worn through at the corners. She placed it on the mantel beside a jar of dried herbs. The act felt ceremonial, as though marking her presence. Jonah watched, but said nothing. He poured 2 cups of water, added coffee grounds, and set them by the fire. The smell of bitterness filled the cabin again, blending with pine smoke. Lila turned. "May I help?" He nodded toward the kettle. "Pour slow," he said. Her hand trembled slightly, but she steadied it. The water hissed, steam rising in soft curls. "It's quiet here," she murmured. "You'll learn the sounds," Jonah said. "Every board and wind gust has a voice. Takes time to tell them apart." A gust of air slipped through the cracks in the door, fluttering the curtain. The fire flickered. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped. Not loud, but close enough for both of them to look up. Jonah crossed to the window, peering out. The slope below was dark now, but he could sense movement. Something or someone passing through the trees. The faint echo of hooves came, seconds later, muffled but unmistakable. Could be deer, Lila said, though her tone was more question than certainty. Maybe, Jonah replied, his hand resting on the rifle near the door. The wind carried another sound, a distant shout, then silence. Jonah's eyes narrowed. He turned down the lantern wick until the room sank into amber dimness. Lila's pulse quickened. They followed us. He didn't answer. Instead, he crossed the room and took her hand. His grip was firm, grounding. If they come, he said quietly, you stay behind the hearth. There's a trap door under the rug. Go through it and keep to the trees. And you? I'll be where they expect me to be, he said. Out front. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire cracked softly, throwing their shadows against the log walls. Two figures caught between fear and the strange calm that follows it. Then Jonah released her hand, picked up the rifle, and stepped onto the porch. The night air was colder now, metallic. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. Below, somewhere in the dark, a horse snorted. Jonah lifted his eyes toward the valley. A thin trail of smoke rose where none should be. He could feel it in his bones, the way men feel a storm long before the rain. Let them come, he murmured, his breath white in the dark. This mountain's got room for ghosts. Behind him, the fire in the cabin gave a small sigh and steadied itself, as if bracing for whatever the wind might carry next. The snow had melted into veins of dark mud, and by morning the air smelled of thaw and smoke. Jonah stood outside the cabin, sleeves rolled up, splitting logs while mist drifted low across the valley. The rhythmic crack of the axe carried steady as a heartbeat. From the doorway, Lila watched in silence, the wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Every swing was clean, certain, no waste, no anger, only motion learned through solitude. Inside, the fire hummed softly. She fed it with the smaller pieces he'd stacked, learning to listen the way he said, to the whisper before the flame, the breath of wood as it caught. When she placed the kettle over the heat, it sighed like something alive. Jonah came in, brushing sawdust from his coat. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. "The mountain hums when it's cold." He smiled faintly, surprised she'd heard it too. "You'll start hearing things most folks forget are there. Wind through pine needles, creek stones turning under ice. They'll talk to you if you listen long enough." "I'm not sure I'm ready for that much company." He poured water into the tin pot and added grounds, the scent of bitter coffee filling the room. Better than silence that stares back. She sat by the table, turning a chipped cup in her hands. The warmth from the fire brushed her cheek, and for the first time since the wedding, she let herself breathe without the ache of fear. Jonah's movements were slow, deliberate, like a man who'd learned the value of stillness after too much noise. Outside, the sun lifted over Coyote Ridge, spilling light through the window. Dust motes swirled in gold. "Show me," she said suddenly. He looked up. Show you what? How to shoot. You said yesterday there might be men following. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Finish your coffee first. They stepped outside. The air bit their skin, bright and raw. Jonah set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log, their dull surfaces winking in the light. He handed her the rifle, its weight heavy against her shoulder. Don't fight it, he said quietly. It's just another kind of heartbeat. Lila took aim. Her hands shook, the barrel wavering. She squeezed the trigger. The crack echoed through the trees, sharp and sudden, the recoil jolting her back. The shot went wide. Jonah stepped closer, his breath ghosting against her hair. You're thinking about missing, he said. Think about breathing instead. She inhaled, exhaled, steadied. This time the bullet clipped the can's edge, sending it spinning into the grass. She laughed softly, startled by the sound. Jonah's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but warmer than any expression she'd seen from him before. Again, he said. They practiced until the smell of gunpowder hung light in the wind. Her aim improved, though her shoulder throbbed with each shot. When she lowered the rifle, Jonah took it gently from her hands, inspecting the barrel as if it were something fragile. You'll do fine, he murmured. You've got patience. She shook her head. No, I just don't want to die helpless. He looked at her then. Really looked. You won't, he said. Not while I'm breathing. Back inside, Lila lit the fire again, coaxing it to life. Her hands smelled of powder and smoke, her pulse still quick from the shooting. She reached for the kettle, poured 2 cups, and thought of the way he'd spoken, without pride, without pity, only certainty. She found the small bag of grounds and measured them by memory now, not by sight. When the brew turned dark enough to hide the flame's reflection, she poured it into his cup and set it beside the old knife, resting on the table. Jonah looked from the coffee to her, something unspoken moving behind his eyes. I made it the way you do, she said quietly. Strong, bitter, no sugar. He hesitated, then sat down, the chair creaking beneath him. Steam rose between them. The smell filled the space like a language only they understood. You'll hate it, he said. I'll learn, she replied, lifting her own cup. The first sip made her flinch, but she didn't stop. For a long moment, they sat without speaking, their breaths rising with the same rhythm, the world outside narrowing to the slow crackle of wood and the weight of quiet between them. Then came a sound, soft but foreign, a scrape against the porch post. Jonah's eyes flicked toward the door. He rose, crossing the floor in 3 silent strides. When he opened it, the wind surged in, cold and sharp. A single sheet of paper flapped against the wooden beam, pinned by a knife. The edge caught the lantern light. Wanted. Jonah Rook for abduction and assault. Lila stood behind him, her cup trembling in her hands. "They think you took me," she whispered. "They think a lot of things," he said, voice steady. He pulled the knife free, folded the paper, and set it on the table beside the coffee. Lila's gaze moved from the knife to him. "What will you do?" He met her eyes. "Same as before," he said quietly. "Build the fire, boil the water, and stay ready." Outside, the wind tore through the trees, scattering ash from the hearth across the porch like dark snow. Inside, the coffee between them cooled slowly, its surface still, reflecting the faint flicker of the flame that refused to die. The day turned still before noon. No wind, no birds, no movement, but the slow drift of smoke from the chimney. It was the kind of silence that felt watched. Jonah stood by the window, the rifle leaning against the sill, eyes narrowed toward the slope below. A trail of dust shimmered faintly in the distance. 3 riders, steady and deliberate, moving toward the cabin. Lila saw it too. She set her cup down carefully, the faint clink sounding too loud. "How long?" "Half an hour," Jonah said. "Maybe less." He crossed the room, checked the door latch, then the bullets in his belt. Lila followed his movements, noting the calm precision of a man who'd done this before. No panic, only habit. "They'll come with papers," he said. "Pike won't risk a blood mess. He'll send Holt first. Law makes a cleaner weapon." Her pulse jumped at the name. Deputy Holt? He looked decent. Jonah's eyes flicked toward her. Decent men follow orders, too. He moved to the shelf, gathering what little food he could into a sack. Lila stepped beside him, her hand brushing his. "If they ask me to go," she said, "I won't." He stopped. "You don't owe me that." "I owe myself that," she answered. "I chose to be here. I'll say it again if I have to." Jonah's throat worked. He opened his mouth to answer, but the sound of approaching hooves cut through the air. 3 sharp thuds, then silence. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. He motioned toward the window. "Stay behind the shutters. Don't open them until I say." Lila stepped into the shadows as Jonah unbarred the door. The hinges groaned once before settling. Outside, the 3 riders waited. Holt at the front, hat in hand, his face drawn and uncertain. The 2 men behind him carried rifles across their saddles, watching Jonah with flat eyes. "Morning, Rook," Holt said, voice carrying a forced calm. "Got something that needs straightening." "Then speak plain," Jonah replied. Holt pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Warrant, signed by Judge Pike himself. Says you took Miss Hart against her will." Jonah let the words settle in the cold air. "You believe that?" Holt hesitated. "A man don't get paid to believe. He gets paid to serve the order." From behind the shutter, Lila's breath caught. She pressed her fingers to the wood, feeling its grain beneath her skin, her heartbeat keeping time with the silence outside. Jonah stepped forward, boots crunching on frost. She's inside. You want truth? Ask her. Holt shifted in the saddle. You know how that looks, Rook. Paper says you're dangerous. Paper lies easy when it's bought. A murmur passed between the two deputies. One of them spat into the dirt. The tension stretched thin as wire. Then, before Jonah could speak again, the cabin door creaked open behind him. Lila stepped out, sunlight spilling across her face. Her hair caught the light like copper thread, and for a heartbeat, even the horses went still. Deputy Holt, she said clearly, her voice firm. You can put that paper away. He blinked, startled. Ma'am? I'm Lila Rook, she said, each word deliberate. I'm where I choose to be. Jonah turned slightly, watching her but saying nothing. Holt's eyes darted between them. Confusion fighting duty. That's so? He asked quietly. It is, she said. You can tell your banker I'm not for sale, and I'm not returning to his house. If he wants my name, he can keep it. I've got another now. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of pine and cold iron. Holt looked down at the warrant, then folded it slowly, tucking it back into his coat. Paper don't argue with a married woman, he said finally. His voice was softer now. But Pike won't like it. Lila's chin lifted. Then he can come himself. Holt nodded once, curtly. You might just get your wish. He tugged at the reins, turning his horse. Let's go. The riders started down the slope, dust rising behind them. Jonah watched until they vanished among the trees. Only then did he exhale. He turned to Lila. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said, but I wanted to. There was no pride in her tone, only quiet certainty. She stepped closer, brushing dust from his sleeve. The warmth of her hand lingered longer than the touch itself. Thank you, Jonah said finally. For what? For being braver than the rest of us. She smiled, small but real. You just taught me how to stand still. He glanced past her to the shutter, where sunlight leaked through the cracks, thin as threads of gold. We won't get many still days, he murmured. Pike's not the kind to let go easy. From somewhere down the valley came the faint echo of a gunshot, distant, but close enough to remind them both that calm never lasts long in Redwater. Lila looked toward the sound, then back at him. Then we'll learn the next thing, she said. After stillness. Jonah nodded slowly. After stillness comes the storm. And from the porch, where the frost was beginning to melt, a single drop of water slid down the wooden rail, falling into the dirt with a sound too soft for anyone but the mountain to hear. Evening bled slow across the ridge, dragging a chill that clung to the trees. The mountain air carried a faint scent of rain, though the sky stayed hard and dry. Inside the cabin, Lila sorted the pantry, flour in jars, coffee tins stacked by size, her movements small but deliberate. Jonah sat at the table, running a whetstone along the edge of his father's knife. The sound, a soft scrape, steady and certain, filled the quiet between them. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked suddenly, not looking up. He paused, blade glinting in the firelight. "I left once. Didn't change much. Red water still follows you. It follows anyone who walks away from it." Outside, thunder rumbled far off, the kind that stays on the horizon but never falls. Lila closed the cabinet door, her fingers brushing something rough behind the jars. She frowned, reached in deeper, and pulled out an envelope, creased, stiff, the corner dark with dried blood. Jonah stood. "What's that?" She turned it over. The seal had been torn, the ink bled by time. It was wedged behind the shelf. He took it carefully, eyes narrowing as he read the name scrawled across the front. Walter Finch. Jonah unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but urgent. "Edmund Pike will not wait another week. He means to meet you by the mine road, says the money's ready. If he cheats you, walk away. Don't go near the ridge. Tell Lila I did my best." The paper trembled slightly in Jonah's hand, though his expression didn't change. Lila stared at the letter, the name pounding through her chest. "My father wrote that," she whispered. "He never came back from that night." Jonah set the letter down gently. Pike met him all right. Probably made sure no one found proof. Lila sank into a chair, her face pale. "Everyone said it was an accident in the mine shaft. That he fell." He shook his head. "Men like Pike don't leave accidents. They write them into the records." For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the fire. Then Jonah crossed to the hearth and pulled aside the iron grate. From beneath the boards, he pried loose a small tin box, its surface mottled with rust. "My father kept things here," he said. "Thought I should know what kind of man ran this valley." Inside were 2 folded pages, brittle with age. He laid them out on the table. One was a map of the Redwater mining claim. The other, a note signed by Walter Finch, written years before his death. "If anything happens to me, Edmund Pike holds the church fund in false trust. He forged the Reverend's ledger. The proof lies beneath the rose and lantern, cellar ledge by room 7. Lila's hand covered her mouth. "The rose and lantern. That's the hotel Pike built." Jonah nodded. "He used God's gold to buy himself a kingdom." Her voice trembled. "And my father knew. He tried to stop it." The fire snapped, sending a bright spark into the air before it fell to ash. Lila stared into the flame, her eyes glassy but hard. "Then we finish what he started." Jonah looked at her, measuring the determination in her voice. "That means going back into town, walking straight into Pike's shadow." She met his gaze. "He's already standing in ours." Jonah didn't argue. He folded the papers, slid them into a leather pouch, and tied it tight. We go at dusk tomorrow. Easier to disappear when the town's half drunk. Where will we start? At the Rose and Lantern, he said. Room 7. As he spoke, Lila's eyes drifted toward the quilt folded on the cedar chest. The last thread of daylight brushed its edge, revealing something strange, a row of uneven stitches unlike the rest. Her fingertips paused there, tracing the ridge of thread that seemed newer, tighter. A thought stirred, half-formed, then slipped away. Jonah caught her glance. Something wrong? She shook her head slowly. Just thought I saw the thread shimmer. He smiled faintly. Light plays tricks up here. But when he turned to hang his coat, she touched the seam again and felt the faintest bulge beneath the fabric, something sewn into it, something that didn't belong. Outside, thunder rolled closer this time, deep and hollow. Rain began to patter against the roof, soft at first, then heavier, masking every small sound except the breathing of two people trying to steady themselves before the storm. Jonah poured the last of the coffee into their cups. Drink up, he said. Tomorrow, the mountain stays behind us. Lila lifted the cup but didn't drink. Her eyes remained on the quilt, the flickering firelight revealing and hiding the uneven stitches by turns. Somewhere in her chest, an answer had begun to stir. Quiet but insistent, waiting for the right night to surface. Outside, lightning flashed once, painting the world in silver. And with it came the faint echo of a distant bell, one she hadn't heard since the day her father died. Night fell without stars. The rain had thinned to a soft hiss, like whispers pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing long amber stripes across the floorboards. Jonah slept lightly in the chair near the hearth, his rifle resting across his knees. Lila sat by the cedar chest, unable to close her eyes. The letter from her father lay open beside the lamp, the ink blotted and trembling, as if it still breathed. She reached for the quilt. Its fabric was soft from years of use, edges worn, colors muted by time. But that one ridge of stitches, newer, tighter, caught her again. The thread was paler than the rest, barely visible except under the trembling light. She turned the edge over and felt it between her fingers. There, beneath the seam, something faintly solid. Jonah stirred but didn't wake. She hesitated only a moment before picking up his small sewing knife. Carefully, she slid the blade under the thread, easing it free. The stitches parted with a quiet sigh. From the narrow opening, a small linen pouch slipped into her palm. It was warm, as though the fabric remembered the hands that had hidden it. She untied the cord, and something rolled out into her lap. A ring. Roughly forged silver, its surface dull but unbroken. Her breath caught. The ring wasn't finished, its edges still rough, its shape imperfect but deliberate. Inside, faintly etched, were two initials. M.R. Jonah's mother. Lila stared at the ring, her pulse loud in her ears. She had never met the woman, but somehow, in that quiet room, she felt her presence, the same patient strength she'd seen in Jonah, softened by gentleness. She closed her fingers around the ring, the metal cold against her skin. Jonah's voice came softly from the chair. Couldn't sleep either? She looked up. He was watching her, eyes half-shadowed, but awake now, the rifle forgotten. I found something, she said, crossing the room. She opened her hand. In the quilt. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the silver. His breath stilled. That was my mother's ring, he said quietly. She never wore it finished. Said she wanted to polish it on the day she knew I was safe. Lila blinked, eyes stinging. Then she hid it here. For you. He shook his head slowly. Maybe not just for me. Maybe for whoever would find it when the time was right. The fire popped softly. Outside, the rain had stopped. The mountain's silence returned. Lila turned the ring between her fingers. It's beautiful, she whispered, even unfinished. Jonah's gaze stayed on her hand. Maybe that's the point, he murmured. Things worth keeping rarely are. She smiled faintly. Then you should wear it. He shook his head. No, it's not mine to finish. Her eyes lifted to his. Then whose is it? He looked at her for a long time, as if measuring the weight of what he might say. The firelight flickered across his face. Lines softened. Guardedness eased. He reached for the ring, his fingertips brushing hers. When I finish it, he said, voice low and certain, I'll know. Lila felt the warmth of the touch linger, traveling through her chest. She wanted to speak, to ask what he meant, but her throat tightened. The air between them was too full, too fragile. After a moment, he stood and walked to the window. The night outside was clear now, clouds breaking to reveal a thin slice of moon. Down the valley, faint and distant, a single lantern light moved through the darkness, steady, deliberate. Someone's riding late, he said. Lila joined him. Maybe Holt, she offered, coming back. Or Pikes, men, Jonah replied, his hand resting on the rifle. They watched until the light vanished behind the ridge. Then he drew the curtain shut. You should rest, he said softly. Tomorrow we move before dawn. She nodded, but didn't lie down. Instead, she placed the ring on the table between them, beside the knife and the folded letter. If we don't come back, she said, I want it to be found again, not lost. Jonah looked at the ring, then at her. We'll come back. Promise? He hesitated, then gave a half smile. I don't make promises to the mountain, he said, but I'll keep this one anyway. Lila drew a blanket over her shoulders and sat near the fire, eyes on the glowing metal. The room smelled of cedar, smoke, and wet earth. Jonah went outside once more, scanning the horizon. The cold bit at his face, the stars cutting clear through the black. When he came back in, the ring was still there on the table, glinting faintly. He reached out, turned it once in the firelight, then placed it in his coat pocket with a quiet reverence. From outside, a faint clang broke the stillness, the church bell of Redwater tolling quick and sharp, out of rhythm. Jonah froze, listening. Lila straightened. The bell. He nodded. 3 short, 1 long. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's not a call to prayer. No, Jonah said, the old weight returning to his tone. It's a warning. He crossed to the hearth and doused the lamp. The cabin sank into shadow. The only light left was the dull ember glow of the fire and the faint silver glint of the unfinished ring against his chest. Outside, the bell rang again, fast, urgent, as if the town itself had woken to something it couldn't name. The storm had cleared, but the air was thick with the smell of iron and rain-soaked dust. Dawn hadn't yet risen. The mountain held its breath under a faint, colorless sky. Jonah saddled dust in silence, checking every strap twice. His movements were quiet but quick, muscle memory sharpened by years of surviving what came before the light. Lila packed the letters and the map into a leather pouch, tucking it inside her coat. The ring, now polished by Jonah's hand to a muted gleam, hung from a strip of thread around her neck. It caught the lantern light once like a heartbeat beneath the cloth. Neither spoke much. What needed saying had already passed between them. By the time the sky began to pale, the ridge below was still cloaked in fog. Jonah pointed toward a narrow path winding into the pines. "This'll take you down through the old creek bed," he said. "You'll come out behind the rose and lantern, near the storage sheds. Nobody'll see you till you're inside." Lila nodded. "And you?" "I'll go the other way," Jonah said, cinching the saddle tight. "Stir the town's attention at the church ruins. Give you time to reach Judge Hale." "2 paths," she murmured. "One purpose," he replied. "We find truth before Pike buries it again." He handed her a small revolver, freshly oiled. "If someone stops you, don't warn them." Lila took it with both hands, the metal cold, the weight unfamiliar. "I'd rather not need it." "Then pray they don't give you reason." They shared a long look. The silence between them was heavy with things that couldn't be spoken. Not yet, not while the world was listening. Jonah reached out, brushing his fingers against the edge of her coat collar. A touch as brief as it was protective. "Keep to the shadows," he said. She smiled faintly. "That's where I found you." He almost smiled back, then turned away before the moment could grow softer. The fog swallowed them as they parted. 2 silhouettes diverging in the half-light, moving down opposite slopes of the same mountain. Jonah's path led west, through black pines and broken fences. He rode hard until Redwater appeared below him, ghost-like in the gray dawn. The church ruin stood at the edge of town. Its steeple collapsed, smoke rising faintly from last night's fire. He dismounted, tied dust in the shadows, and stepped over the scorched threshold. Inside, the air smelled of wet ash and burned hymnals. He kicked through the debris, pulling a handful of old bullet shells from the dirt floor. It was enough noise to draw attention. Within minutes, he heard the echo of boots behind him. "Jonah Rook," a voice barked. "By Pike's order, you're under arrest for the murder of Walter Finch." Jonah straightened, wiping soot from his palms. "Then you better bring a judge who isn't bought." Two deputies entered, rifles raised. He fired once, not to kill, just to scatter. The shot cracked the morning open, echoing through every alley in Redwater. By the time they regrouped, Jonah was already gone, the echo of his horse fading into the fog. Meanwhile, Lila moved quietly through the narrow ravine, the sound of the creek whispering beside her boots. The cold seeped into her bones, but she kept her pace steady. Every few minutes, she'd glance back, half expecting Jonah to appear behind her. When she reached the edge of town, she crouched among the cattails and watched the rose and lantern rise before her, a grand building of red brick and polished windows, too fine for a town built on sorrow. Lights still burned in a few upper rooms. She waited until a wagon rattled past, then slipped through the back gate. The smell of whiskey and wet hay filled the air. She found the cellar, doors half hidden beneath a tarp, and pushed them open, the hinges groaning. Inside, darkness. The air was cool, damp, layered with the scent of earth and old wood. She lit her small lantern and descended the steps. Each footfall echoed, too long. At the far wall, she found what she'd come for, a low shelf of ledgers, behind which the brick had been patched unevenly. She tapped it, hollow. She set down the lantern, pried at the mortar with a chisel from the workbench, her breath shallow. The bricks loosened one by one, and behind them lay a small tin box, tarnished with age. When she opened it, the contents glittered faintly. A bundle of receipts, a ledger marked Redwater Relief Fund, and beneath it, a folded page signed E. Pike. Her pulse quickened. Proof. From above, a board creaked. Voices murmured. One was low and certain. Pike's. Lila blew out the lantern just as a shaft of light cut through the cracks in the ceiling. She pressed herself flat against the wall, clutching the box to her chest. "Judge Hale's in town," Pike's voice said. "Keep her comfortable till I decide what she's worth." A chair scraped. Boots shifted. Then, silence again. Lila waited, counting her heartbeat, until she heard the door close. Then she slipped the box into her satchel and made for the stairs. At the top, the hallway stretched empty, light flickering from an oil lamp near the far door. Number 7. She steadied her breath, crossed the hall, and knocked 3 times, slow, deliberate. For a moment, nothing. Then the latch turned. The door opened just enough for an eye to appear behind the crack. "Who sent you?" A woman's voice. Lila met it steadily. "Walter Finch," she whispered. The door swung wider. Judge Miriam Hale stood there, night robe half drawn, eyes sharp with recognition. "I've been waiting for you," she said. And behind her, the room glowed with the quiet firelight of someone ready to listen and to fight. The oil lamp flickered low in Judge Hale's room, throwing long shadows across the wallpaper. The smell of ink and old tobacco hung in the air, authority and sleepless nights. Lila stood by the desk, dripping from the rain, her satchel pressed tight against her chest. Judge Hale gestured her in, closing the door with a firm click. "Lock it," the judge said. Lila obeyed, her fingers trembling on the bolt. Hale, tall and silver-haired, moved with the kind of precision that came from years of weighing men's lies against the weight of paper. "You said Walter Finch sent you. He's dead, isn't he?" "Yes, ma'am," Lila answered. "But his truth isn't." She emptied the satchel onto the table. Letters, ledgers, and the blood-stained envelope spread out like cards in a gambler's final hand. Hale's sharp eyes darted from page to page, her breath tightening as she read. "This is it," she murmured. "Embezzlement, false ledgers, threats, all under Pike's name." "He killed my father to bury it," Lila said. "And he'll kill again if we don't stop him." Judge Hale looked up, face pale but steady. "Then we'll stop him tonight." She dipped her pen in ink, signing across a fresh warrant. "With this, I can bring the marshals before dawn. Pike's walls won't stand long in daylight." Outside, gunfire cracked. One shot, then three more. Hale's head snapped toward the window. "Your husband?" Lila peered through the curtain's gap. "He said he'd cause a distraction at the church. That's his way of saying goodbye." "Don't you believe it," Hale said. "Men like that don't leave their hearts in burning buildings." Lila's smile was tight, grateful. "Then I'd better make sure he has something to come back to." They bent over the papers together, signing and sealing, while gunfire ebbed and flared in the distance, each echo slower, weaker, like thunder rolling away from a dying storm. Across town, the alley behind the church glistened with rain and smoke. Jonah crouched beside a broken fence, reloading his rifle by touch. His breath came slow and measured. A single lamp flickered at the far end of the street, throwing thin light across the mud. Footsteps. He turned. Deputy Holt. Rifle drawn, face pale. "Holt," Jonah said quietly. "Put the gun down." "I can't," Holt replied. "Pike's men say you shot first." "Then they're lying, like they always do." "Maybe. But Pike owns this town. The badge don't mean much against that." "Then why wear it?" Holt hesitated, lowering the rifle a fraction. Rain beaded on the brim of his hat. Because once a man named Walter Finch pulled me out of a collapsed tunnel when Pike's men left me there to die. He said justice doesn't live in paper. It lives in choices. Jonah watched him. Then make one. The moment hung heavy, thunder without lightning. A door slammed open. Pike's voice cut through the rain. "Deputy Holt, bring him in or I'll shoot you both." Holt turned, eyes narrowing. He raised the rifle again, but not at Jonah. "Sorry, Mr. Pike, I already made my choice." He fired once. The bullet caught Pike's hired gun square in the chest. The man dropped without a sound. "Didn't think you'd do it," Jonah said. "Didn't think I would either. Now move before Pike figures out who's really in charge." They slipped through the alley, rain slicking the mud beneath their boots. Somewhere down the street, the church bell began to toll again. Slow this time, heavy with promise. Back in the hotel, Judge Hale pressed her signet into hot wax, sealing the final warrant. "It's done," she said, passing the parchment to Lila. "Deliver this to Holt if he's still breathing. By dawn, Pike will be in irons. He'll stand trial. He'll wish he could hide behind one." Hale blew out the lamp. Thunder faded, replaced by the steady drip of water from the eaves. Lila slipped the warrant into her coat and moved to the door. "Mrs. Rook," Hale called softly, "when this is over, don't disappear into those mountains again. Men like your husband, people like you, this land needs more of that kind of courage." Lila gave a faint smile. "We only ever wanted a place to live honest." "Then make sure you get to see it." Outside, the moon painted the street in ghostlight. She pulled her collar tight and walked toward the bell. At the far end of town, two silhouettes approached. Jonah's broad frame and Holt's shorter stride, rifles slung low. Both turned at her approach, relief softening their faces. "You made it," Jonah said. "So did you," she replied, breath catching. Holt tipped his hat. "Judge Hale sent that?" Lila handed him the sealed warrant. "Said to bring it at first light." He tucked it into his vest, eyes glinting. "Then Redwater's about to wake up different." Jonah met her gaze. Exhaustion edged with pride. "You did it, Lila." "No," she said, quiet but steady. "We did." Behind them, the first hint of dawn colored the clouds, a pale ribbon of light spreading over the valley. It felt fragile, almost holy. Jonah glanced toward the eastern ridge. By sunrise, Pike's empire falls. Lila's fingers brushed the silver ring at her throat. "And then?" He smiled faintly. "Then we go home." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet pine. And something else. Change. And somewhere behind the hills, the church bell began again, this time slow and sure, calling not to fear, but to justice. Morning came thin and gold, spreading like quiet mercy across Redwater. Dew clung to the roofs, and the air smelled of pine and cold iron. The courthouse steps gleamed wet from the night rain, where Judge Hale stood with her papers, waiting. Jonah and Lila rode in slow, side by side, mud on their boots, eyes steady. Deputy Holt met them halfway, his badge catching the light. Behind him, the marshals lined up, rifles ready, silence thick as prayer. Edmund Pike appeared on his porch, coat buttoned, chin lifted, as if dignity might still save him. "Mr. Pike," Judge Hale called, her voice cutting clean through the square. "You are under arrest for fraud, theft, and the murder of Walter Finch." The crowd held its breath. The only sound, the morning wind and the soft rattle of the cuffs as they closed around his wrists. Pike struggled, but no one stepped forward to help him. His power was already gone. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Not likely," Hale said. "You taught this town what fear costs. Today, it pays the debt." Lila stood at the edge of the crowd, her father's letter in her pocket, the silver ring glinting at her throat. She didn't cheer when the wagon door shut. She only whispered, "It's done." Jonah heard her and nodded. Justice at last. The crowd broke into applause, hesitant at first, then steady. Holt glanced at Jonah. "Guess Redwater's breathing again. Let's keep it that way." Judge Hale turned toward them. "You've given these people their town back. Don't let the mountains keep you from coming down again." Lila smiled faintly. "We just wanted a place where the world felt honest." "Then you've earned it," Hale replied. Later that morning, the bell of Redwater tolled, not for death, but for renewal. In the rebuilt church, Reverend Collins waited by the altar. Jonah and Lila stood before him, faces soft in the light that filtered through cracked glass. "10 days ago," Collins said, "I bound you by need. Today, I bind you by truth." Jonah took her hand. The same silver ring, once hidden in the quilt, gleamed bright now, polished smooth. He slipped it gently onto her finger. "I do," he said, voice low but sure. Lila looked up at him, tears bright in her eyes. "And I do." The Reverend smiled. "Then let the mountain and this town bear witness. You are husband and wife, in peace and in storm." Outside, the bell rang again, clean and full, echoing down the valley like a promise kept. Holt was waiting by the hitching post when they stepped out. "Heading home?" he asked. "The ridge is waiting." "Can't blame you," Holt said. "You've seen what too much town does to a man." He handed Jonah a folded notice. "Marshall's taking Pike east to stand trial. He won't crawl his way back from that." Jonah tucked it away. "Then Redwater's free." Holt smiled faintly. "Free's a start. Honest will take work." Lila touched his arm. "You're the one to see it through." The deputy tipped his hat, pride glimmering in his tired eyes. "I'll try." They rode out just as the sun broke over the ridge, the town shrinking behind them, clean and golden. The trail wound upward, dust rising beneath their horses' hooves. The air thinned, sharp with the scent of snow. At the mountain pass, the wind changed, colder, watchful. Jonah pulled his horse to a stop. Ahead, 5 riders blocked the narrow way. At their front, a man stepped down from his saddle. "Caleb Barrow," Jonah said quietly. "Time bomb," the man nodded. "Been 10 years since you killed my brother." Lila's heart thudded. She saw the wear in Caleb's eyes. Grief turned hard. "He came for me," Jonah said. "I gave him a chance to walk away." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And you? You walk away from this?" Jonah didn't answer. The wind howled between them, carrying the smell of cold stone. Then Lila slid down from her horse. Her voice was soft, but sure. "You can't fill an empty grave with another." Caleb looked at her, uncertain. She unclasped the silver trom from her hair and placed it in his hand. "This belonged to my mother. She taught me peace is a kind of courage, too." The metal flashed between them, fragile and human. Caleb stared at it for a long moment, then stepped back. "Go on, Rook. I reckon the mountains judged you enough." Jonah gave a slow nod. "Maybe it's time we all stop answering to ghosts." Caleb motioned his men aside. The riders parted, leaving the trail open. Jonah took Lila's hand and mounted again. As they passed, Caleb lifted the trom slightly in silent salute. By the time they reached the ridge, sunlight spilled full across the valley. Below, red water shimmered, small, alive, and finally free. Lila turned in the saddle, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think peace will hold?" Jonah glanced at her, the light catching his gray eyes. "If we choose it, every day." The wind shifted warm, carrying the faint toll of the church bell. Steady now, not warning, but blessing. They rode toward home where coffee waited, and the sound of a cradle would soon join the morning birds. The wind on the ridge carried the smell of cold stone and pine sap. Clouds drifted low, dragging long shadows across the pass where the trail bent toward home. Jonah rode ahead, his coat snapping in the wind, Lila close behind, her scarf pulled tight. The storm that had threatened since morning was finally breaking apart, sunlight slipping between the clouds in brief, trembling bursts. They had crossed through silence for nearly an hour. The world below was a sea of white and gray, the valley half lost to mist. Each hoofstep echoed like a heartbeat against the frozen rock. Lila's hands were stiff around the reins, but her eyes were soft, following the trail not for danger now, but for peace. "You think Caleb meant it?" she asked quietly. Jonah didn't look back. "A man can't hold on to anger forever, not without it hollowing him out." She nodded. "Then maybe we can all stop bleeding for old ghosts." He gave a faint smile. "That's the plan." The mountain wind rose, cutting cold against their faces. It carried with it the faint echo of something. A bell, far away, ringing slow and even. Jonah paused, listening. "The church," he murmured. "They must be burying Pike's name for good. Or blessing what comes after, Lila said, her voice warm through the chill. By midday, they reached the flat of the ridge. Their cabin appeared through the thinning mist, its roof glinting faintly with a crust of snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady, patient, as if the place had been waiting. Jonah dismounted, boots crunching on the frost. He tied the horse, then turned to help Lila down. Her hand slipped into his, small and sure. "It feels different," she said, looking at the cabin. "Like it finally belongs to us." "It always did," Jonah said. "We just had to earn the right to come home." Inside, the warmth hit them like memory. The fire crackled. The kettle on the stove whispered steam. Everything smelled of cedar and coffee. On the table sat the quilt, folded, clean, the silver ring now resting atop it. Beside the hearth, a small wooden cradle waited, polished smooth, its sides carved with simple vines and stars. Lila stepped closer, her fingertips brushing the cradle's edge. "You finished it," she whispered. Jonah nodded. "Did most of it after you fell asleep. Figured the sound of carving was quieter than worrying." She smiled softly. "And what will we name the child who'll sleep here?" He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with the faint wonder of a man who never thought he'd live to see such a sight. "If it's a boy, Thomas, for your father. If it's a girl, Mary, for my mother." Lila looked up, eyes shining. "Then either way, they'll be born from love that survived." She sank into the chair by the fire, one hand resting over the small swell beneath her coat. Jonah knelt beside her, his palm covering hers. In the quiet light of the western sky, Jonah and Lila's story comes to rest, not in triumph or tragedy, but in peace. After years of solitude, loss, and courage, they found something rare on that mountain ridge, a life built not from struggle, but from understanding. The wind that once carried echoes of fear now whispers of home, and the sound of a single church bell becomes the song of forgiveness. Stories like this remind us that love doesn't fade with time. It deepens, it softens, it forgives. Maybe that's why we keep returning to the Old West, not just for the dust and the wide horizon, but for the quiet proof that second chances still bloom, even in rough soil. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear what it stirred in you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us what love and redemption mean to you. And if you'd like to keep journeying through the wild, tender world of Western tales, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you'll never miss the next story waiting out there beneath the endless Western sky.